Maybe we don't give enough credit to how we've been wired in our opposition to our female sisters, right? Pretty soon, instead of scoring points against the girls, by the time you're a teenager in high school and a college student, the cultural narrative is, okay, now how can you score with women? And so, early on, a girl is your opponent as a boy. Later on, they are objects to conquer, right? How much damage does this do to the formation of how we think about women? And has it actually set up us to have this fraught, tragic, messy relational dynamic?
Welcome to Practicing the Practices. This is an experiential podcast where we not only want to help you learn about the way of Jesus, we want to help you practice the way of Jesus in your everyday life. Hey, today on episode 3 of season 3, we are dropping some bombshells, Casey. We are talking about the nature of friendship between men and women in a post-Me Too world. So are you ready for this?
I mean, what could be more fun than to just rile some feathers and poke the sleeping bear?
There's a chance this will be our most listened to podcast and our last episode all together. We'll see how it goes. But seriously, we're glad that you're here. We're talking about friendship, and we feel it's very important to address some of the difficulties and challenges, but also the necessity for gospel-formed people to have friendships that cross the gender barrier. Men and women must be friends. So, Casey, in late 2017, the hashtag #MeToo went viral. I believe it was Alyssa Milano who tweeted it out. Next thing you know, thousands, millions of women are tweeting this, recognizing that they too kind of feel a connection to this movement. All this stemmed from the Harvey Weinstein criminal allegations of sexual harassment and misconduct, which really began a movement and a reckoning to expose the underbelly of sexual misconduct in our society, primarily in what we might refer to as some of the elite sectors or the corners of our society. So Hollywood, we saw one after the other, primarily men, get canceled, lose film projects, begin to be prosecuted because turned out they had been abusing their power and coercing women in unhealthy ways. We saw it in government. We saw it in, all of a sudden journalists were no longer the news broadcasters and so forth. And sadly, this movement made its way to the church, and a new hashtag, Church2, began to become viral. And we were shaken by the harrowing accounts of sexual misconduct. And I bring this up, and I bring this to the forefront of this episode on friendship because it really brought into our consciousness the age-old struggle between men and women. Matter of fact, in the very immediate aftermath of the Me Too movement, many women began to fear the backlash of what would come. Not so much that there would be some sort of retribution, although I'm sure there was some of that, but for so many years, many women had fought to get invited to the corporate board meeting, to sit on a leadership team, to have a voice, to feel some nature of equality in a society, to rise up in, quote unquote, a man's world. And all of a sudden, now there's this kind of movement exposing kind of the sin, this misconduct. And one of the fears that I found interesting in talking to female colleagues and friends at the time was, okay, now we're going to actually go back. And all of a sudden, these barriers in the workplace, barriers in friendship, things like the Billy Graham rule kind of became back into the consciousness. This is going to become the norm again to avoid scandal. So all that to say, the Me Too movement, the Church2 movement brought another layer of challenge and complication to an already complicated matters, friendship between men and women. And so on the outset, Casey, I'd like to get your perspective. As a woman, what it's been like to build friendships with men, what it's been like to kind of
interact, quote unquote, in a man's world. So the floor is yours.
Well, I'm so glad we're talking about this, Brad, because I do think it's something that we just don't talk about a lot in the church. I think in my experience, and I know my experience is limited, but I think most of the Christian environments I've been a part of, the answer is we just don't want to deal with it. So just keep men and women away from each other unless you're married. And, if your coworkers, the pastor that's on staff with you, your friend's husband, just stay away from them in every possible way, and then there won't be an issue. And so we were talking, earlier today about you can kind of fall in that ditch of just completely separating men and women out so they can't be friends at all. And then on the other side, we can fall into the ditch of just lacking wisdom and saying there's no difference and there should be no rules.
Right.
And so trying to find that middle ground, it can be messy, it can be difficult, but I think it's a conversation worth having. And you and I are friends. And so I think, we're coworkers, we're friends. And so I think that it's really important. We've been able to do this. We've been able to navigate a relationship where you're a man and I'm a woman. We work together and I would consider you my friend. And I feel like we've been able to kind of walk that middle line. And so I'm excited to talk about this today.
I am glad to talk about this with you because I think we can hopefully share some experiences, particularly over the last year as working colleagues and friends, that we can not only kind of name some of the challenges, but maybe provide a pathway forward.
Yeah.
I think there's plenty of really bad examples. There's plenty of negative, look at the harm, right? I don't know that I've seen very many helpful, practical, gospel-rooted pathways forward that embrace kind of the fullness of what we think God calls us to, what Jesus calls us to. And that's what I'm really looking forward to. But to your point, to your perspective, one of the things that was interesting for me as a dad of a daughter who's now in high school, but in her early elementary years, her personality, her interests made her not as susceptible to some of the kind of the early childhood drama that maybe is portrayed that young girls have. She didn't typically want to be a princess at Halloween. She wanted to be Optimus Prime or a football player, right?
That's awesome.
She one of the first things that she wanted as a 2-year-old was a Tim Tebow jersey, right? So she maybe kind of sat outside of some of society's norms on that. And I remember that was all hunky-dory until 3rd grade. And all of a sudden she comes home in 3rd grade and there's tears and there's emotion and there's sadness. And what had happened is she had been made fun of at school. She'd started to get picked on a little bit because her best friend was a 3rd grade boy. And this 3rd grade boy was a bit quirky, had unique interests, and that connected really well with my daughter, who at the time had kind of some quirky interests. And so at lunchtime, they would pretend to be dinosaurs, and they had all this goofy stuff. And all of a sudden, though, by the time 3rd grade comes around, kids begin to understand how to bully and be mean, and she started getting made fun of because the only imagination for male-female relationship post 3rd grade is romantic, right? And she's like, no, that's not it. And it got really weird for her. And it got to me to thinking about how, particularly, this is the man's perspective. I'm going to ask your experience, but how often maybe we don't give enough credit to how we've been wired in our opposition to our female sisters, right? From an early age, we play lots of gender-specific games as competitions. It's boys versus girls. And I'm not even saying there's anything wrong with that. Matter of fact, most of the time, the girls are winning anyways, right? In those early formative years. But pretty soon, instead of scoring points against the girls, by the time you're a teenager in high school and a college student, the cultural narrative is, okay, now how can you score with women? And so there's early on, a girl is your opponent as a boy. Later on, they are objects to conquer, right? How much damage does this do to the formation of how we think about women? And is it actually set up us to have this fraught, tragic, messy relational dynamic? I know you have shared with me some of your own experiences in how odd or quirky on both ends of the spectrum it's been.
Yeah. Couple experiences I had in college that were, I think, formative looking back now. I don't know if I knew they were formative at the time, but now looking back, they were formative in this message of, if I'm talking to a male, there must only be one reason why a male and a female would interact, right? And setting young ladies up to feel like they're doing something wrong almost if they interact with men in their world, in a Christian environment specifically. So on opposite ends of the spectrum, these two experiences I had in college, I think were pretty formative. One of them was I had this teacher. He was an awesome Bible teacher, and he was really great in class, and he had all these cool methods of teaching the Bible, and I was so intrigued and interested learning the Bible in this guy's class. And I started to notice that whenever I would try to ask him a question, like after class, I would like go up, I would be so interested in something he said, or it would like really like pique my interest or kind of get me thinking. I would want to go up after class, or I'd see him at the campus coffee shop, like outside around a bunch of people, and want to ask him a question about it. Or maybe I had a question about our exam or our homework. He would never look me in the eye. And I would see him talk to guys on campus, and he would totally interact with them and like joke around and be friendly. And then when I walked up to ask him a question, he would look at his computer or look at his book and like just kind of answer me without looking at me. And I just remember thinking, this is so weird. It took me a while to put together, like, I think it's because I'm a female. And, he was married, and I'm sure was very committed to the purity of his marriage and his relationship. But in protecting himself from looking inappropriate with young college females, who is half of the people that he's teaching, he just wouldn't look us in the eye.
He kind of created almost an adversarial.
Yeah. So
dynamic.
I felt like every time I had to ask him a question, I was doing something wrong, and I didn't have the same access to my Bible teacher as the men in the class did, because I was female and I was somehow dangerous. Looking me in the eye was going to open up the pathway toward danger in
Or
some
how
way.
could this be misconstrued?
Exactly.
Or any of those narratives.
Exactly. So there was that. And then there was another experience I had in college where I was working on like a college break. It was like a, winter term or something. And I was working in the writing center, and there was a professor that was like this adjunct guy that had his office there. So I had been finishing up a tutoring session. I was eating lunch, and this guy walked past me, and it was like warm. And it's California. So I had flip-flops on. And I had taken my flip-flops off and was like eating my lunch and had my feet up on the couch. And this guy walked by and tickled my feet. And I was like, what in the world? I was so like taken aback that somebody would do something like that I just kind of like giggled. I didn't want to like make a scene, of course. And I tucked my feet underneath me. Like I sat on my feet and was like, oh, and he like walked. It was really awkward, and he walked away. And like maybe 20 minutes later, I was kind of still reading my book, eating my lunch, had my feet up, and he walked by again and grabbed my feet and said something kind of weird about how he was a teacher and I shouldn't move away from him or something. I don't remember exactly what he said. And I again laughed and like tucked my feet under me and kind of left the building at that point. Then I ended up talking to my boss and telling them, and found out that this teacher had made many young ladies on campus feel uncomfortable. He ended up getting terminated from that position. And I remember he was forced to apologize to me, and he brought me into his office the next time he saw me, closed the door where there was no window, which was like, hello, read the room, buddy. Like, this was probably not the best decision.
You're still not getting it.
Yeah, you're not getting it. And was like, well, apparently you took what I did as inappropriate. So I guess I'm sorry that you took it that way. It was kind of the apology I got.
The old victim. The victim gets shamed.
Yeah, it was my problem. And I remember thinking, man, why didn't I have the wherewithal in the moment to be like, hey, that's not okay, and that makes me really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
He was an authority figure on campus. I was a student. And I think just, I thought that it was going to be silly, that he was going to say, well, you just took that the wrong way, or all the things we hear. So I did have that experience. Those are two formative college experiences, I think, in my relationship with men in power in both circumstances.
Yeah. So you got one experience where you're not honored as a person, as a student.
Yeah.
You get treated as other in some ways that are like the boundary, the separation is so significant, it becomes adversarial. And then you've got another situation where a man doesn't recognize your autonomy, right? Your right to not be treated that way.
Yeah.
And even doesn't recognize it afterwards. I think my guess would be is that there's probably several women listening to this who have that kind of experience. And so I'm glad for you to share that. And one of our goals is to say, okay, there's got to be a better path than being unable to interact or have any sort of meaningful relationship with a female, or with a female with a male. And there has to be some sense of wisdom that isn't just foolish or hurtful and problematic. So this is really important. One of the other things we wanted to acknowledge is just like this isn't some sort of mirage. It's not like we're talking about a fantasy. This is a real issue. This is a real challenge. You shared with me earlier when we were just talking that one of the ways you realized, oh, there's a dynamic at play here is a little over a year ago, when you came on staff as the pastor for spiritual formation here at Fellowship West. You didn't realize all that meant. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I would say probably one of the other big formative experiences in my life as a Christian woman in relation to gender was taking this job as pastor for spiritual formation. I don't want to say that I was naive, but I think I underestimated the very strong feelings in both directions that people have towards a female taking the title of pastor. I thought like, oh, that might be something that ruffles a few feathers maybe, but I just didn't realize both the inspirational meaning that would have for some people, and then also how very vehemently opposed some people would be. So a couple of things on the positive side that I just wasn't expecting is probably my second week on staff, or maybe like the first time I got up and did something more substantial in our service. And I will say that I don't really teach a ton, but I do lead a lot of prayer moments. I give announcements. I do welcomes. I lead a lot of experiences on our staff. And so after the first time I had done one of those, I had a woman come up to me almost with tears in her eyes and just tell me how meaningful it was for her to see a female on the church stage.
Wow.
And she was, and I've had a couple women say that since, and she was just kind of overcome by it and how important that was to her as a female. And I was like, wow, like it felt like I had this mantle that I was carrying for other women that I wasn't even aware that I had. And I felt the weight of that, and not in a negative sense, just like, wow, this is something important to people that I just wasn't expecting. And even my daughters, I never really thought about how that would impact my daughters. I just didn't think it would be that big of an impact. My daughters are used to me teaching and leading in other situations. I'm a yoga teacher, so they see me do that. They've seen me speak at things in that way. And so I just didn't really think about it. But I think, again, the first time I got up and really spoken, we were telling the kids on the way to church what we were going to do. The girls were like, wait, mom's doing that? And I have a husband that is so supportive of my voice being elevated to the point where sometimes I'm like, no, you do it. And he's like, no, you do it, Casey. Like, my husband is so committed to elevating my voice. And so he was like, yeah, guys, mom is doing that. But my girls hadn't really seen that. Because Neil's been a pastor for a long time. They've seen him get up and speak a lot of times, but they had not seen me get up and be the one leading something in a church service. And after I sat down, I remember they were like, Mom, you slayed that. You were like a boss up there. And they were kidding around, but I really do think there was something significant for them seeing me get up and lead something on a Sunday morning.
Totally. And for another day and another episode, I think you've kind of brought to surface one of the things that we need to really dig into in the church is we need more voices of both men and women in the church, right? We need partnership. We need laboring together. We need side by side. But to your point, it did bring strong feelings. Some people are like, "This is so amazing," and then other people are like, "Well, we're out of here."
Yeah, it wasn't all joy and roses,
saying words
Brad.
in the church services. Yeah, no, I got a few of those emails, and that's okay.
Yeah, and I honestly have had family members that have directly told me that I'm in sin. So, I mean, there's just really strong feelings about women using the title pastor.
And the point we're making is we're not making up this conflict or this tension. It's there. what we want to do now is kind of turn to, okay, how do we thoughtfully, rooted in the scriptures, saturated in Jesus, empowered by the Spirit, like as gospel people, create a more hopeful path forward? How do we rewire? How do we reform ourselves in such a way that we see the necessary beauty in one another? For men, how do we develop a vision of treasuring instead of threatening? A vision of appropriately protecting and honoring instead of abusing? A vision of our sisters as partners and not objects? And then, Casey, for women, how can they begin to see men in healthier ways? Like that's, I've kind of focused on some of the unhealthy vision of men towards women, but it obviously exists both ways. And it's my sincere belief that this formation subject we've been focusing on, friendship, deep, meaningful, wise, spiritual friendship, might be the answer to the rewiring that we need. Now, another tension we've got to acknowledge is that we live in a hyper-sexualized society, an over-sexualized society. One great illustration of this is it's popular now for people to read the letters of the founding fathers, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, and so forth, in the way they would write to each other and oftentimes express deep affection. And the language they would use in sharing their deep affection has caused many people to speculate, were the founding fathers gay men? Were they, in same-sex relationships or whatever? Because we have such a limited scope of how we can relate to it. We only imagine love and affection in erotic terms, right? You got a whole society who had a construct know that we can actually have this deep, meaningful, heartfelt affection for each other and verbalize it, and it actually have nothing to do with the erotic and had everything to do with just love, genuine affection for the other person. So we're willing to recognize that, right? Our culture's imagination of love and male-female friendship is almost exclusively erotic and sexual, which means, Casey, I believe we have an incredible opportunity as followers of Jesus, as disciples, to live the upside-down kingdom to a culture and create an alternative imagination for that culture. And so, Casey, here's the definition of friendship. I want you to feel free to respond to this. These are just some basic definitions from the dictionary. Number one, a friend is a person attached to another by feelings of affection and personal regard. That feels like something that can go across the gender barrier.
Absolutely.
A person who gives assistance and support. Like that, what a beautiful picture that would be in friendship. And a person who is not hostile. I think that's a pretty good starting place for rewiring our male-female friendship imagination, that we would be have attachment and affection and personal regard for you, that I would be someone who wants to give assistance and support to whatever your endeavor is, to what you need in life, and that, frankly, I would just not be hostile, that I would not be adversarial to you, but I would, by definition, be a friend. So, Casey, we want to add some kind of practical principles to this. And I've put together 4 principles, and I just want us to engage on these things together. Principle number 1 is to rewire and reform our male-female friendship imagination. We have to honor Imago Dei. Number 2, we need to welcome diversity between the sexes. Number 3, we need to walk friendship out in wisdom. And number 4, we need to reject the categories of fear and foolishness in how we relate to men and women. So first of all, honor the Imago Dei in each other as men and women. If you're new to that phrase, Imago Dei, what it simply means is just Latin for in the image of God. It means that men and women have been created with equal dignity, equal value. We might be unique and different from one another, but that has no bearing on what we bring to the table. Men and women bring intelligence, beauty, worth, and value. But sometimes our culture tries to undermine that in some ugly ways.
Yeah, I think that's such an important first piece to kind of have as a foundation. And just even as Christians, regardless of men and women, just remembering that when God made us, he called us good. And if we just let our story, we've talked before about not letting our story start at Genesis 3, but at Genesis 1.
Yes.
When we were made very good. And if we just let our story start at sin and the curse, then, what's one of the main things that the curse attacks? The male-female relationship, right? And so I think our goal here is to go back to Genesis 1 and remember that we were made to live in cooperation and harmony with one another and not constantly, like you said, undermining each other. One of the things that came to my mind when you were just talking was like Everybody Loves Raymond. Great show, right? Yeah. However, I think there's just so many cultural norms that we just need to be aware of, like, that men are just kind of these like dumb,
oafs,
bumbling oafs, and women are like these hyper controlling, that sitcom stereotype. We just need to be mindful of those things. I think it's a great, hilarious show.
Yeah, it's a satire. It's trying to poke fun at that, right? I love Ray Romano.
Yes. But I do think it is just really good to be mindful that we both possess the image of God and the qualities of God.
So for the men listening there, that locker room talk, that boys will be boys, those are not acceptable excuses for sinful words and attitudes towards women. When you find yourself, men in particular, I'll speak to men as a man, in a circle of men who like to kind of poke fun and take these little kind of cheap stereotype shots at women, or in even worse ways, degrade them physically or however it might be. Like, your discipleship to Jesus is in a crisis because God created that woman. You're to see her as a sister who is to be cherished, thought well of, honored, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, because I hold you in high regard, Casey, I don't have to patronize you. We can actually debate. We can argue, right?
Yeah.
We can have, I don't have to treat you as other if I actually honor the dignity you've been made with. The second thing we say here is that we need to welcome diversity in the sexes. Now, Casey, I'm being a little broad brush here, but men and women are by and large wired in some unique and different ways. Not in every way. My wife loves football. How much do you love sports ball, Casey?
I love it 0%.
0%, right? So you can't put everybody in one category. Right. I know my son Simon. So his dad has sports memorabilia in his work office, in his home office. All of his metaphors are sports. And we're sitting on the couch last night, and I'm like, "Do you want to watch the football game with me?" And he says, "Dad, ever since I was 5 years old, I have hated watching sports." Now, there's a little part of me that wants to correct that, wants to shame him, wants to say, "No, son of mine will prefer to do something else," but he would rather do craft time than watch football, right? That doesn't make my wife more masculine. That doesn't make my son more feminine, right? But when you think about kind of how we're wired emotionally, maybe one gender is a little bit more on the whole wired towards nurture, another towards, strength. It's part of our biological history, right? Those things might make us unique, but they don't make us opponents. Actually, our diversity is a beautiful thing. The fact that we're different is very complimentary.
Yeah. And I think that can allow us to honor each other's perspectives in an even fuller way. Like, I think there's many times where you've said, "Well, what's your perspective on this, Casey?" Because not just because I'm a female, but because I just bring maybe a different, if I'm sitting in a room with all men on staff, I might just have a different way of looking at it because my experience is different as a woman. So I think you do a really great job, Brad, honestly, of making me feel like I have an equal voice at the table and also that I bring a unique perspective. And I think when we talk about those ditches we can fall on either side, this is another way we can do that. We can fall into like men and women are so different. Their roles are completely set. Boys can't like pink, girls can't like sports. That's one ditch on the other side. And then just on the flip side is that there's no difference, that we don't have any unique, that it's wrong to highlight that women might be more nurturing. And I think we got to, again, stay in the middle, stay on the path. And it's hard to hold those two tensions on opposite side. But that's kind of what we're shooting for, is to find a way to honor both the uniqueness and the things about us that are the same.
What we're trying to say is there is a healthy masculinity and a healthy femininity that in partnership is really good and complementary. And when we say masculine and feminine, we don't mean the narrow moment in time cultural definitions of that, right? But the broad, and one of the things about this so good about the scripture is the scripture gives us a broader vision for how we think about gender, right? And some of those constructs. You know, David is a warrior. He goes to battle. He kills the giant. He's a man's man who also writes poetry and plays the harp, right? Mary, mother of Jesus, gentle, nurturing woman, who is metaphorically referred to as like the dragon warrior princess, right? Who saves the day, right? It's a bigger, more robust vision, and we need each other. All right. Principle number 3. To really have healthy friendships, we have to walk friendship out in wisdom. That means we have to reject some of the codification of each other as threats. What I mean by that is, you know, one of the things that you might hear talked about in male-female dynamics is the Billy Graham rule, this idea that a man should never be alone with a woman ever, right? And some of the stereotypes is that as a man doesn't get on the elevator, you know, at the doctor's office to go to the second floor if it's just a woman on the elevator or whatever. And the problem with that codification is it exclusively makes us in an adversarial position to each other. You become exclusively a threat to me if I say, I will never be alone with Casey or any other woman at all in any other context. And then, as you mentioned earlier, on the other end of the spectrum, it's very problematic if we don't have any guidelines or rules at all. And so I want to just banter about how we might think about wisdom. So here's some examples of what I've considered wisdom and how I navigate this in my own life. As a man who has friends who are females, work colleagues who are females, and who pastors a church that is 50% female. I can say I will never interact with, you know, the half of my congregation and significant number of my colleagues, or I can find ways to work this out in wise, appropriate ways. So, you know, one of the things that was kind of a rule for a lot of my, you know, mentors is, you know, you never meet with a woman alone, right? Well, what happens when I've got a woman in my church who needs some sort of pastoral counseling and I don't have a mega church staff with a woman who's just devoted to meet with the women, right? Or what if her desire is for deeper theological knowledge, right? And she's coming to me. Or what if my spiritual formation pastor needs to meet with me to talk about a spiritual formation initiative in our church? Do I believe that I can meet with you or any other woman alone? Absolutely, with wise provision. So for me, it's as simple as this. Can we grab coffee or lunch? Yeah, so let's meet at Starbucks. Let's meet at Einstein Bagels. Let's go to Salsaritas. But we don't have to have candlelight like dinner at Ruth's Chris together, right?
Right.
The environment and the intention does a lot to shape that experience. Another for me, Casey, and you can speak to this as well. You and I will talk a lot as friends and as colleagues about real life stuff in our life. We'll talk about our kids. We'll talk about work stuff. We'll talk about school. We'll talk about culture. But I don't share with you, nor do you share with me, like your marriage conflict, right?
Right.
Like there's like this sacred line, like, hey, I might make jokes about Neil wanting to watch baseball movies with you, or you might make the same kind of stuff towards me, but I'm not confiding in you.
Yeah, there's an intimacy boundary there for sure.
Yeah, that's really important. Text messages. I might even put emails in this categories. I'll send you a text message. You asked me, hey, are we on to record at 10:30 today? And I said, yes, ma'am. And like you sent like a Pam Beasley gif,
Yeah.
like that's totally okay. But we're never going to text with innuendo. We're not going to text inappropriate things. We're not going to get too personal.
Right.
And I never delete any of my text messages.
That's wise.
And so my wife at any time could pick up and read every text message we've sent ever since, we started, whatever. So we're in my office here recording a podcast. We've got Ethan Crenshaw over here controlling the levels. Hello, Ethan. And out, my door has a giant window in it. Matter of fact, when I moved into this office, it had a little tiny window in it. And we retrofitted it with a larger window, right? So that anybody can come by my office, look in. And I intentionally didn't put any blinds on my office. Most of the rooms in this building have blinds on them, but mine do not, so that anything that's happening in my office can be seen. In every room where I have a computer, the computer screen faces the room. It doesn't face the wall. Simple things like that. One last thing I'll just say, and then you can add any that you might want to, is in my calendar, I never have like some sort of, the only time I don't have explicit details in my calendar if I'm meeting someone is if it's of a confidential nature. Like maybe I'm meeting with someone who I'm concerned that they're in a domestic violence situation. I might keep the name coded, but by and large, if you and I are meeting to discuss an event at work, it just says Casey Anderson, 9:30 at the office or at Starbucks or wherever it might be. And those are just little things. So here's, to me, is the wisdom, right? Is it's public, it's not in the darkness, and it's also normal, right? I'm just going to treat you like a normal human being.
Yeah.
And I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I agree to all these. I think these are all really great rules. And I think that they're being on the other side of them and also kind of living my life this way towards the men in my life. I can say that none of these things as a female make you feel like you're just some temptress that's out to lure some man away from his wife and children. Because that is how sometimes the rules that men set, I think well-meaning, can make women feel. Like the only reason I would want to meet with you is because I'm some harlot that's trying to come and, destroy your life, where maybe I just had a question I wanted to talk to you about. So I think those are really good. The other thing that I would add is, I think it's fair to, again, be wise and know that sometimes you will be interacting in a male-female relationship, and it's a very innocent interaction, and there will be an attraction. I don't think it's fair when we're married to assume that we're never going to feel an emotional or physical attraction to someone else. And one thing that mentors of my husband's and I shared with us a long time ago was we are not just in a romantic married relationship, but we're in a brother-sister in Christ relationship. And we need to be able to support each other in places where there might be a temptation or an issue. And so one of the things that they suggested, and this is hard to do, but I do think it really is helpful, like you mentioned, Brad, when things are in the dark, that's where they have power. So if you're meeting with your trainer and you realize like, oh, I think my trainer is cute, could you be in a relationship with your spouse where you could say, hey, babe, just want to let you know, everything's fine. Everything is appropriate, but I just noticed that I felt a physical attraction to my trainer. I mean, I know this is like, I'm dropping a little bit of a bomb here because you have to have a lot of security in your relationship with your spouse to be able to do this. But if you can get to this point of honesty where you can just go, okay, hey, thanks for sharing. I think it just takes all of that secret, dark lure of those kind of moments that we can play in our head and just takes the power out of it.
And it also normalizes something that's fairly normal, right?
Right.
So if Julie and I are watching a movie and Ryan Gosling happens to be on the screen,
Yeah.
and
she or any of her female friends think that he is an attractive man, there is no part of me that is surprised by that, right? Like that, there's a normalness to our humanity there. Another thing we might bring in the mix here, here's some things that are on the warning sign, right? When you experience attraction, it's not always physical. Sometimes it's an emotional intensity, right? And if you find yourself with a member of the opposite sex, and you're married, let's qualify, we're married. If you're two single people and you find yourself really emotionally attached,
Go for it.
Like that's a different conversation about how to like pursue that, right? But if you're married and have a friend or a work colleague of the opposite sex and you find yourself getting kind of emotionally enmeshed, here's a phrase that I'm not a fan of. It's kind of fun, kind of hilarious jokes in the workplace. The idea that you have a work wife and then another. And what that usually means is you have this kind of unique bond that kind of feels other. I think that's almost always unhealthy and unhelpful. And I don't like the language. There should be nothing that creates any sort of competitive threat or dynamic to your actual husband or wife, to that marriage. And so if you find yourself, man, I'm really kind of getting emotionally attached and I'm sharing vulnerabilities with this person who's not my spouse, that's a good sign that we are really in a danger zone.
Yeah.
That maybe there's something unhealthy in our marriage or there's something unhealthy in this particular relationship. Wisdom is an important factor in this. We can treat each other with honor. I can invite you and involve you in leadership development. I can respect you, but I also can be thoughtful and wise towards my spouse, how I relate to you. The fourth and final thing is a little bit, maybe even a subset of this wisdom, and that's to reject the polar kind of opposite ditches of fear and foolishness. Jen Wilkin will include the link to the article in the notes for this podcast, but she wrote a really good article about how the church needs men and women to be friendship. And talked about, hey, obviously sexual or physical attraction's a red flag and it shouldn't be dismissed. But that doesn't justify declaring all male-female friendships as impossible. Matter of fact, she goes on to say that every relationship is risky, marriage, work, and so forth, but that we have to be able to serve side by side, that partnership, it's not a matter of if it can exist, but it must exist. And again, it's easy to live in the extremes here, right? Where in our over-sexualized culture, we see each other exclusively as threats. And so I'm going to set up like extreme boundaries where I can't even relate to you, like your college professor who couldn't even look at you in the eye when you wanted to ask an academic question. Nor am I going to kind of pretend like, hey, there shouldn't be any guidelines, right? So we want to avoid this fear where all of a sudden friendship with a man or a woman, especially in the church, like we get a phobia of it. And we want to reject the foolishness. And one of the things that Jen Wilkin points out, and we'll kind of close with this, Casey, I'll give you a chance to respond, that we got to follow the example of Jesus. She writes, Jesus extended deep personal friendship to both men and women. We are not him, so here's the wisdom. So following his example requires wisdom and discernment about our own propensity to sin as well as that of others. But his example is worth following, brothers and sisters, even if it involves risk. Mark 3:35, for whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. There's a both and there. I'll give you the last word.
So I just love Brad using that model of Jesus as we think about not only how we interact with anyone, but specifically how we interact male and female. And I do think it's really important to consider that if we create a model in the church where men and women can never get close or experience friendship in any way, what message is that going to send to women about how they can relate to God, who is male, God the Father, and Jesus, who was a man? So what do we want to communicate to women specifically about how they can interact with Jesus, how they can interact with the Father? Is there more of a barrier for them than there is for you because you're a male? And I love the idea of how Jesus interacted with females. I think he interacted in a way that was appropriate, but also very affectionate and loving. He had very close friends that were female. And I think that as in anything, if we follow his example, then we're on the right track.
That's a good word. So, as always, we want to give you a practice. And so this one's a little bit more complex. There's not like a really easy buttoned up, okay, pray this prayer, do this piece. But I want to encourage two categories of practice. One is to reflect, and the second, on the other end of that, is to reimagine. So reflect, men and women listening, ways that you may have been misformed, deformed, wired in adversarial ways towards the other gender. What are some ways maybe where women have been kind of cast as less than, or threats, or exclusively, as you said, Casey, temptresses? And maybe there's some ladies here who, understandably, maybe you've experienced some things, and maybe that's colored your vision of all men, and you see all men as patriarchs and abusers. Like, what are some ways that we've maybe been malformed? And then, how might we reimagine how we relate to our brothers and sisters? Who's someone in your sphere of influence that you can begin as men? Who is the woman in your sphere, in your circle, that you can begin reimagining as sister in some healthy ways? Like, it's that familial language of the disciples' life is really important, because I'm going to protect my sister. I'm going to honor my sister. I've got my sister's back. And I'm going to argue with my sister too, right? There's a level of respect and protection and honor that's healthy. Like, ladies, who is that brother that you can relate to? What if you reimagined one anothering them in some ways? And over time, we could slowly create a vision for the world where men and women were co-laborers, co-partners. After all, God did put Adam and Eve in the garden, and he said, I want both of you to rule over it. I want both of you to keep it. I want both of you to cultivate this beautiful thing together. That's the plan. That's the intent. And so, Casey, I need you.
I need you too.
And listeners, I hope this has been helpful. So I encourage you to reflect. I want to encourage you to reimagine. Until next time, this is Brad for Casey. Thanks for listening to Practicing the Practices. We'll see you soon.